Mexico is a country built on family, faith, and the idea that women are to be protected. In every village, every city, every working-class home, the mother, the daughter, the wife is supposed to be the one person nobody touches. That is what the songs say. That is what the church says. That is what the men with guns say when they want you to believe they have honor. But for the women in these cases, none of that protection was real. The same men who claimed to live by a code stood over them, marked their bodies, and dumped them where the world could see. Some were cartel members themselves. Some were mothers who refused to stop searching. Some were reporters who refused to stay silent. All of them paid the same price. Today we are covering 10 cartel women who were punished by the cartel. What you are about to hear will show you exactly how cheap a woman's life becomes the moment a cartel decides she is in the way. Section 1. Zulma Hernandez, El Chapo's mistress, marked with Z's. Zulma Julia Hernandez was born in 1974 in Mexico, and her early life followed a path that almost no one would have predicted would end the way it did. Before she ever stepped foot inside a prison cell, before she ever met the most powerful drug lord in the world, she wore a uniform. Zulma worked as a federal police officer in Mexico, a job that gave her training with firearms, an understanding of how criminal investigations worked, and a front-row seat to how deeply organized crime had wrapped itself around her country. At some point in her 20s, that career ended, and Zulma crossed over to the other side of the law. She became involved in armed robbery, and in 2002 she was arrested and sentenced to serve her time at Puente Grande, a maximum security federal prison in the state of Jalisco. Puente Grande was supposed to be one of the toughest prisons in Mexico. In reality, by the time Zulma arrived, the prison was being run from the inside by a single man. That man was Joaquin Guzman Loera, better known to the world as El Chapo. He had been sentenced in 1995 and had spent years turning Puente Grande into something closer to a private hotel. Guards worked for him. Wardens looked the other way. He had access to phones, to fine food, to alcohol, and to women. When Zulma entered the prison, she was in her late 20s, tall, blonde, and striking. El Chapo noticed her almost immediately. According to interviews Zulma later gave to Mexican journalist Julio Scherer Garcia, the first time El Chapo had her brought to him, he sent flowers and a bottle of whiskey to her cell afterward. She told the journalist that during their relationship inside the prison, El Chapo treated her like royalty. In her own words to Scherer, she said she felt like his queen. The relationship between the most wanted drug lord in the country and a female inmate continued for the better part of a year. In January 2001, El Chapo escaped from Puente Grande in one of the most embarrassing prison breaks in Mexican history. The official version of events says he was smuggled out hidden inside a laundry cart pushed by a corrupt prison employee. Zulma was still serving her sentence when he left. She was eventually released a few years later, and instead of trying to start over with a clean life, she chose to stay close to the world El Chapo had pulled her into. The Sinaloa cartel, which El Chapo led, was expanding aggressively across Mexico. Zulma became part of that expansion. According to multiple reporters who later investigated her life, she was given responsibility over Sinaloa cartel operations connected to Mexico City. She had moved from being a prisoner who shared a bed with the boss to being a cartel operator with real power. What Zulma did not understand, or maybe what she understood but could not avoid, was that being close to El Chapo made her a target. By the mid-2000s, the Sinaloa cartel was at war. The most dangerous group they were fighting was a cartel called Los Zetas. Los Zetas had originally been formed by deserters from the Mexican army, soldiers trained in special operations who had been hired as bodyguards for the Gulf cartel before breaking off and forming their own organization. They were known for tactics that even other cartels found extreme. They did not just kill enemies, they sent messages. In December 2008, Zulma Hernandez disappeared. A short time later, her body was found inside the trunk of an abandoned car. She was 34 years old. She had been killed with a single gunshot wound. But the killing itself was not the message. The message was carved into her body. Across her chest, her stomach, and her back, her killers had cut the letter Z into her skin multiple times. The Z stood for Los Zetas. They had murdered the woman who once shared a cell block romance with the boss of their biggest rival, and they had signed their work into her body so there would be no confusion about who had done it and why. Zulma Hernandez was not killed because of anything she had personally done to Los Zetas. She was killed because she had once been something to El Chapo. To the men who put her in that car trunk, she was a tool. Her death was a way of telling El Chapo that the people he cared about, the people he had touched, the people he had pulled into his world, were within reach. The message was that no one around him was safe. For El Chapo, the message arrived at a moment when he was already losing people. Earlier that same year, his son Edgar Guzman Lopez had been killed in a parking lot in Culiacan in a hail of automatic gunfire. The war between Sinaloa and its rivals was claiming family, lieutenants, and now a woman who had once written him love letters from a prison cell. Zulema's killing did not make headlines around the world the way some other cartel deaths did. There was no televised trial. There was no manhunt for her killers. Her body was claimed, she was buried, and the war kept going. What her story showed, with brutal clarity, was the rule that women in the orbit of cartel leaders rarely escape from. They are visible because of who they sleep with. They are valuable because of what they know. And when the men they are tied to make enemies, those enemies often come for them first, because killing them costs less and hurts more. Zulema's death was a warning sent to one man. But the next woman in this video shows that cartels do not always have to wait for someone to be a girlfriend or a wife before they decide she has crossed a line. Sometimes all it takes is a photograph posted online and the wrong people seeing it. And when that happens, the cartel's reaction can be even more savage than what was done to Zulma in that car trunk. Section 2. Joselyn Alejandra Nino, the skinny girl killer who became a trophy. Joselyn Alejandra Nino was barely out of her teens when her face went viral across Mexican social media in January 2015. She was around 19 or 20 years old, slender, and from Rio Bravo, a town in the northern Mexican state of Tamaulipas that sits just across the border from Texas. To people who scrolled past her photo online, she looked like she could have been a college student. She was smiling, her sunglasses pushed up on top of her head, a gold chain around her neck. The only thing wrong with the picture was what she was wearing and what she was holding. She had on a bulletproof vest. In her hands was an assault rifle. The photo was uploaded by an anonymous person to a Facebook page called Valor por Tamaulipas, a citizen-run page that posted information about cartel activity in the region. The caption identified Joselyn as a member of the Gulf Cartel based out of Rio Bravo. She was given the nickname La Flaca, which in English means the skinny one. The nickname had two meanings. One was simple, a reference to her thin body. The other was darker. La Flaca is also a name used for Santa Muerte, the skeleton saint that many people in Mexico, including a large number of cartel members, pray to. The photo got over 1,500 likes on Facebook and was shared more than 40 times. People in the comments argued about her. Some thought it was strange that a girl who supposedly worked for one of the most powerful criminal groups in the country was photographed in such a low-income setting. The room behind her did not look fancy. There were no piles of cash, no luxury cars in the background. Just a young woman with a gun and a vest in what looked like an ordinary house. For people who imagined cartel life as non-stop wealth and glamour, The photo was a quiet shock. It showed that the women on the bottom rungs of the ladder did not actually live like the bosses they worked for. They risked their lives for a salary, while the men at the top kept the mansions and the helicopters. Joselyn was a foot soldier. She belonged to a faction of the Gulf Cartel called Los Ciclones, which means the Cyclones. Her boss was a man known by the alias Ciclone 7. Her job was to help defend Los Ciclones territory from a rival faction within the same Gulf Cartel called Los Metros. By early 2015, the Gulf Cartel was no longer a single united group. It had split, and the two halves were at war with each other. Los Ciclones controlled some areas, Los Metros controlled others. Rio Bravo, where Joselyn was based, was actually mostly Los Metros turf, which meant her group was operating in dangerous territory every single day. She worked in this role for at least 4 months. Cartels in Mexico had started recruiting women like Joselyn for a specific reason. Female members could move through checkpoints, pass by police, and walk into rival territory without raising the same red flags that men with similar weapons would. A young woman with a girlfriend look could go places a tattooed male enforcer never could. That was her value to the cartel. It was also what made her replaceable. When Joselyn's photo went viral, she lost her cover. The same image that made strangers on Facebook curious about her also let her enemies see her face clearly for the first time. Investigators later said the leak was almost certainly done on purpose by someone inside Los Metros. It was part of a wider strategy that both Gulf Cartel factions were using against each other in early 2015. They would post photos and personal information of rival members online, hoping that either the police would arrest them or the rival side would track them down and kill them. Sometime between April 12th and April 13th, 2015, Los Metros got to her. According to investigators, Joselyn was captured along with 2 other people from Los Ciclones, another woman and a man. They were taken somewhere private. The 3 of them were tortured before they were killed. Investigators believe the torture was done to pull information out of them about Los Ciclones operations. After they were killed, their bodies were broken down and packed into beer coolers. On the morning of April 13, 2015, an abandoned truck was found in a parking lot of a Soriana supermarket in Matamoros, a city in Tamaulipas not far from Rio Bravo. Inside the back of the truck were 3 coolers and plastic bags containing what was left of the 3 victims. Joselyn was identified by her tattoo, the word Nino, which was her own surname, written across her forearm. She was estimated to be in her late teens or early 20s. The other woman and the man were never identified by name in public reports, but investigators believed they were also part of Los Ciclones. Los Metros made sure no one missed the message. They posted a photograph of the 3 bodies on Twitter, along with a written note in Spanish. The note told Los Ciclones that this was what would happen to anyone who supported their faction. It mocked them for using female fighters and warned them that more deaths were coming. The note was signed by a Los Metros member who used the alias 65. In the end, Joselyn Niño's life as La Flaca lasted only a few months in the public eye. Her photograph was online for just over 3 months before she was killed. She had no big house, no convoy of armed men, no chance to climb to the top of the cartel ladder. She was used by her own organization for her looks and her ability to blend in. And when her enemies wanted to send a message, she was the perfect target. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case shows that being female and crossing a cartel does not always require being part of one. Sometimes all it takes is being elected to public office and refusing to take their money. And what one cartel did to that woman would shock all of Mexico. Section 3. Maria Santos Gorostieta, the mayor who refused to be bought. Maria Santos Gorostieta Salazar was born in 1976 in the small town of Tiquicheo in the western Mexican state of Michoacán. Tiquicheo was the kind of place most people outside Mexico had never heard of, a quiet, rural community of farmers, ranchers, and a few thousand families who lived off the land. Maria grew up there and left only to chase something almost no one in her town had managed before. She wanted to become a doctor. She studied medicine at the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo, earned her degree, and came back home as a trained physician with a sense of duty to the place that raised her. Most people would have stopped there. A doctor in a town that desperately needed one was already a rare thing. But Maria kept going. She married a man named José Sánchez Chávez, who had himself once been the mayor of Tiquicheo. They had 3 children together, and in 2008, when she was 32 years old, Maria won the election and became the mayor of her hometown. She walked into a job that nobody truly safe ever wanted. Michoacán was one of the most violent states in Mexico. The mountains and coastline of the region were prized by drug trafficking groups because the state was a perfect doorway. South American cocaine could be unloaded at the Pacific port of Lázaro Cárdenas. Synthetic chemicals shipped in from Asia could be turned into methamphetamine in hidden labs in the hills. Marijuana and opium poppies grew in the same hills. Whoever controlled Michoacán controlled a fortune. And by the time Maria took office, the cartel that controlled it was a group called La Familia Michoacana, which would later split and become the Knights Templar cartel, known in Spanish as Los Caballeros Templarios. Cartels in places like Michoacán did not just smuggle drugs, they ran the towns. They forced shop owners to pay them protection money. They put their own people into local police forces, and most of all, they bought the mayors. A typical mayor in a cartel-controlled town had 2 choices: take the money and look the other way, or refuse and become a problem. The problems did not last long. Maria chose to be a problem. She refused to take bribes. She publicly criticized the cartels. She told reporters that the most important thing for a person in her position was to not be afraid. And from the very first months of her time in office, the people who ran Michoacán made sure she knew they had heard her. In January 2008, only 3 months after she became mayor, Maria and her husband were driving near a rural community when armed men ran them off the road. The men did not kill her that day. They fired their guns into the air and warned her to resign before it was too late. Maria did not resign. A year later, in January 2009, she and her husband were attacked again by armed assailants. They survived with minor injuries. She still did not resign. In October 2009, the men who wanted her gone stopped warning her. She and her husband were driving through a rural area when gunmen ambushed them. Jose stepped out of the vehicle to make a phone call, and that was when the shooting started. He was hit 3 times and killed. Maria ran toward him to try to protect him and was shot multiple times herself. The gunman left her for dead, and that is the only reason she survived. She was found wounded next to her husband's body and rushed to a hospital. 3 months later, in January 2010, it happened again. Maria was traveling back from an event with 4 other people, including the head of the town's Women's Institute and a journalist. Armed men opened fire on the vehicle. She took bullet wounds in her stomach, her chest, and her leg. The driver was hit twice. The vehicle crashed after the shooting, adding more injuries on top of the gunshots. This time her wounds were so severe that she had to live the rest of her life with a colostomy bag attached to her abdomen and constant pain. A lot of people would have walked away. Maria did the opposite. In 2011, she published photographs of herself in the town's official municipal newsletter. In the photos, she lifted her shirt and showed her surgical scars and the colostomy bag. She wrote that she was not ashamed of what had been done to her. She called her body living proof that she was a strong and righteous woman. She told the people of Tiquicheo that she would keep fighting as many times as God allowed her to, for the children, the women, the elderly, and the workers of her town. Her term as mayor ended in 2011. She tried to run for a seat in Mexico's National Congress and lost. After leaving office, she lost her police protection and her bodyguards. She went back to being a private citizen with 3 children, a second marriage to a man named Nereo Patiño Delgado, who had once been her bodyguard, and a target on her back that had not gone away. On November 12, 2012, Maria was driving her young daughter to school in the city of Morelia when armed men ambushed her car. According to witnesses on the street, Maria begged the kidnappers to leave her daughter alone. She got into their vehicle willingly so the little girl would be safe. Her family reported her missing 2 days later. For 5 days, no one knew where she was. On November 17, 2012, laborers found her body in a ditch beside a road in Michoacán. She was 36 years old. The official cause of her passing was a fatal blow to the head. Her body showed clear evidence that she had been tortured before she was killed. Investigators believed the Knights Templar cartel was responsible. No specific person was ever publicly charged for her killing. The cartel had finally finished what they started in 2008. Maria had warned, in her own writing, that what happened to her could happen to any woman who refused to play along. The next case proves she was right, except this time the woman did not even hold a public office. She just had a keyboard, a fake name online, and a story to tell. Section 4. Marisol Macias, the editor killed for tweeting the truth. By 2011, the Mexican border city of Nuevo Laredo had a problem nobody was allowed to talk about. The city sat right across the river from Laredo, Texas, which made it one of the busiest crossings in North America for both legal trade and illegal smuggling. Trucks rolled across the international bridge every hour. So did weapons, drugs, and money. The city had been taken over by a single cartel called Los Zetas, a group that had originally been formed by deserters from the Mexican army. Los Zetas had a simple way of running the city. They controlled the police, they controlled the politicians, and they controlled the news. Local newspapers in Nuevo Laredo had been beaten into silence. By 2011, the largest paper in the city had stopped reporting on cartel violence entirely. They had no crime reporter. Editors who tried to publish stories about shootouts in the streets, dead bodies hanging from bridges, or police officers on cartel payrolls had been threatened, attacked, or killed. The newspaper offices themselves had been targeted with grenades and gunfire over the years. So the people of Nuevo Laredo started doing something the cartel had not figured out how to stop yet. They turned to the internet. A website called Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, which translates to Nuevo Laredo Live, became a lifeline for ordinary citizens. People would log on and post warnings about which streets to avoid because of a gunfight, where roadblocks had popped up, which neighborhoods were under cartel control that day. They used fake names. They protected each other. And one of the most active voices on that site went by the pen name La Nena de Laredo, which means the girl from Laredo. Behind that pen name was a real woman. Her name was Maria Elizabeth Macias Castro, also known in some news reports as Marisol Macias Castañeda. She was 39 years old. She had spent years in journalism in Nuevo Laredo and worked at the local newspaper Primera Hora, where some sources described her as the editor-in-chief and others described her as a senior administrative figure on the news side. She had previously worked at El Mañana, another newspaper in the city, which had itself been attacked by gunmen at least twice. Maria Elizabeth knew exactly what kind of city she was living in. She knew what had happened to journalists who had tried to report cartel news under their real names. So she did what many people in her city had done. She kept her day job inside an industry that had been forced to look the other way, and she used the internet to do the reporting her own newspaper could no longer publish. Under the name La Nena de Laredo, She posted on Twitter and on Nuevo Laredo en Vivo. She wrote about shootings. She wrote about the cartel. She trusted in the Mexican Army and Navy to protect citizens who tried to fight back with information. Nobody outside her closest circle was supposed to know La Nena de Laredo was her. That was the whole point of the pen name. Somehow Los Zetas figured it out. How they did it has never been confirmed in public. Some people believed someone she worked with leaked her identity. Others believed her phone or computer was compromised. There is no clear answer. What is clear is that on September 24, 2011, her body was found in a busy, well-traveled section of Nuevo Laredo, near the Christopher Columbus Monument, a stone landmark that anyone in the city would recognize. Beside her body, the cartel had laid out a keyboard, computer cables, and discs. They had also left a handwritten note. The note was written from her own perspective, using her pen name, as if Los Zetas wanted to put words in her mouth one last time. Translated from Spanish, it read along these lines. Okay, Nuevo Laredo en Vivo and social media sites. I am La Nena de Laredo, and I am here because of my reports and yours. For those who do not believe this happened to me because of my actions, for trusting in the Army and Marines, thank you for your attention. La Nena de Laredo. The note was signed with multiple letter Z's. That signature was the same one Los Zetas used in nearly every public killing they wanted credit for. It was the same Z that had been carved into Zulma Hernandez's body 3 years earlier. The keyboard and cables placed next to her body were a signal too. Los Zetas were not just claiming responsibility for her death. They were telling the entire city of Nuevo Laredo and any citizen tempted to log on and post about the cartel that they could find anyone hiding behind a screen. Maria Elizabeth's case became historic for one reason. According to press freedom groups, including the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders, she was the first documented journalist in the world to be killed by a drug cartel specifically in retaliation for reporting on social media. 11 days before her killing, Los Zetas had hung 2 young social media users from a bridge in the same city with a note warning against using the same website. Just over a month after her killing, on November 9, 2011, another moderator from Nuevo Laredo en Vivo, who used the screen name Rascatripas, was beheaded and left at the same Christopher Columbus monument. The cartel was making a pattern out of it. Maria Elizabeth had 3 kids and a family who had to mourn her in a city where her own newspaper, the place she had worked for years, did not even publish news of her death because they were too afraid. The website she helped build posted a banner with her username and a message that translated to, "You will always be present." UNESCO condemned her killing. So did press freedom groups around the world. No one was ever publicly arrested or convicted for her killing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case shows that cartels did not stop with newspaper editors. A few years after Maria Elizabeth's killing, another Mexican woman would discover that even tweeting under a fake name from a hospital break room was no longer safe. Section 5. Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio, the doctor they murdered through her own Twitter. Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio was 36 years old, a mother, and a physician who lived a normal-looking life in the Mexican border city of Reynosa. By day, she worked at the Tierra Santa Clinic. She also held a second job as an occupational health doctor at a maquiladora, one of the large textile factories that dot the border region between Mexico and Texas. To the people who knew her in person, she was a working mom with a phone always in her hand. They thought she was answering messages, scrolling, doing what most people in 2014 were doing on their phones. They had no idea that the phone in her hand was actually the only weapon her city still had against one of the most violent cartels in the country. Reynosa sits directly across the Rio Grande from McAllen, Texas. The state of Tamaulipas, where the city is located, was at that point split between two cartels at war with each other, the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas. By 2010, the cartels had already crushed the local press into total silence. Newspapers in Reynosa were not allowed to write about cartel violence. Reporters who tried had been kidnapped or killed. As one Committee to Protect Journalists report put it, the cartels controlled the government, the police, and the media. If the front page of a Reynosa newspaper said the city was peaceful, the readers knew it was a lie. But no one could publish the truth. So the people of Reynosa moved their reporting onto Twitter and Facebook. They created a citizen network that operated under fake names, used Catwoman avatars, and tagged their posts with a hashtag called #ReynosaFollow. Anyone in the city could log on, post a warning about a shootout on a specific street, and within seconds, thousands of other residents knew which routes to avoid. It was crowdsourced safety. It saved lives every single day. And the most dedicated and fearless poster in the entire network was a user known only as Felina. Felina ran the Twitter account at the handle Mute3. Her avatar was a Catwoman image. By 2014, she had thousands of followers, retweets across the city, and a reputation as one of the most reliable sources of information in all of Tamaulipas. She also worked as an administrator on a hugely popular page called Valor por Tamaulipas, which translates to Courage for Tamaulipas, with hundreds of thousands of followers across Twitter and Facebook. The cartels had been hunting the people behind Valor por Tamaulipas for years. In February 2013, an unidentified cartel circulated a flyer offering a reward of $44,000 for anyone who could provide the names of the page administrators. Felina had been warned many times to be more careful. Friends inside the Citizen Reporting Network told her she was getting too active, too aggressive, that she should stop posting so often. In the weeks before she went silent, threatening messages had started showing up on her Twitter timeline. On October 8, 2014, a tweet from another user warned her directly. It read in Spanish that they were getting close to several people, and Felina should be careful. She kept posting anyway. What no one online knew at the time was that Felina was Dr. Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio. On the morning of October 15, 2014, sometime before noon, armed men in two vehicles pulled up outside the Tierra Santa clinic in Reynosa. Witnesses inside the clinic later told reporters that gunmen jumped out and grabbed Maria, along with another doctor and a nurse. They forced all three into the vehicles and drove off. According to one widely reported version of events, Maria had treated a young child earlier that morning. The child had been brought in by his teenage parents with a serious medical emergency. Maria administered emergency medication and arranged for the child to be transferred to a larger hospital. The child did not survive the trip. The parents of that child were reportedly connected to the local cartel, and the kidnapping that followed may have started as revenge for the death of the child in her care. Once she was in their hands, the cartel went through her phone. They scrolled her messages, her photos, her contacts, and then they found her Twitter account. They realized that the doctor they had just kidnapped was Felina, the same Felina who had been exposing cartel activity in their city for years. From that moment on, she was no longer just a doctor caught up in a personal grudge. She was the prize the cartels had been hunting for over a year. What happened next was something no one had ever seen before. In the early hours of October 16, 2014, just after 3 in the morning, 4 tweets posted from the Mute3 account in rapid succession. The first one read in Spanish. Friends and family, my real name is Maria del Rosario Fuentes Rubio. I am a doctor. Today my life has come to an end. The next 2 tweets, all in capital letters, told her followers not to make the same mistakes she had, that they would gain nothing from it, that she had found death in exchange for nothing. and that the cartels were closer to all of them than they thought. The final tweet was posted at 3:11 in the morning. It told her followers to close their accounts and not to risk their families like she had risked hers. It ended with the words, "I ask for forgiveness." Attached to that final tweet were two photos. One showed Maria alive, sitting against a dark background, looking at the camera. The other showed her after she had been killed. Twitter shut down the account within hours, but the images had already been shared across the internet. The Tamaulipas State Attorney General's office reported her as kidnapped. They could not officially confirm her passing because her body was never recovered. To this day, no one has ever been arrested. The next case proves that even after a woman has spent years personally hunting cartel members and seen her own daughter taken from her, the cartels can still come for her on the one day in Mexico that should belong only to mothers. Section 6. Miriam Rodriguez Martinez, the mother who hunted the cartel. Miriam Elizabeth Rodriguez Martinez was born on February 5, 1960, in San Fernando, a town in the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. She lived an ordinary life there for over 50 years. She was a wife, a small business owner who ran a Western-style clothing store, and most of all, a mother. She had several children, but the daughter who would change the course of her life was named Karen Alejandra Salinas Rodriguez. By the time Karen was in her early 20s, she was bright, full of life, and a young woman with her whole future in front of her. Then one day in 2012, Karen got into her car in San Fernando, and that was the last time her family ever saw her. San Fernando in 2012 was one of the most dangerous places in all of North America. It was completely controlled by Los Zetas, a cartel originally formed by deserters from the Mexican army. Los Zetas were not just drug traffickers. They had built a business model around kidnapping. They would grab anyone they thought a family could pay a ransom for. Local farmers, business owners, even bus passengers passing through. San Fernando had already become infamous for two of the worst massacres in modern Mexican history. In 2010, 72 migrants from Central and South America had been killed by Los Zetas in the same town. In 2011, the bodies of nearly 200 more people had been pulled from clandestine graves there. The cartel had so much control over the police and local government that ordinary people had no one to turn to. When Karen was taken, 2 trucks pulled up beside her car and armed men forced their way in. They drove off with her inside. The phone calls started right after. Los Zetas demanded thousands of dollars in ransom payments. Miriam and her family did everything the cartel asked them to do. They took out a loan from a bank that had actually started offering credit specifically for ransom payments because kidnappings in Tamaulipas had become so common that financial institutions had figured out how to profit off them. The family left the bag of money at the drop-off point exactly as instructed. Karen never came home. For 2 years, Miriam waited, searched, and did not give up. In 2014, the truth finally came out. Karen had been killed not long after her kidnapping. Her remains were eventually found on an abandoned ranch outside the town. Miriam went to the ranch herself. There, she found her daughter's scarf, a cushion from her daughter's truck, and a single bone from her body. A friend of Miriam's later told the BBC that after that day, Miriam said she felt incomplete and nothing in her life would ever be normal again. Most parents in her position would have collapsed into grief. Miriam did the opposite. She decided that since the police were not going to do anything about the cartel members who had taken her daughter, she would do it herself. At 54 years old, this small business owner from a quiet Mexican town turned herself into a one-woman investigator. She bought wigs, changed her hair, used different clothes as disguises. She got fake identification cards. She carried a fake pistol that looked real enough to scare people. And she started hunting. She spent hours every night scrolling through social media, building files on the men she believed had a hand in her daughter's kidnapping. She tracked their relatives, their girlfriends, their photos, the cars they drove. When she identified one of them, she would stake out his home, follow him on foot if she had to, and call the police the moment she had enough information for them to make an arrest. According to the New York Times, one of the cartel members she tracked down had left the cartel and become a flower vendor on the streets. Another had become a born-again Christian and was sitting in a chapel when police finally arrested him. The congregation actually protested the arrest. Miriam had no patience for that. She reportedly responded by asking where his compassion was the day they killed her daughter. Over 3 years, Miriam personally helped Mexican authorities locate and arrest about 10 members of the Los Zetas cell that had kidnapped Karen. She founded a group called Citizen Community in Search of the Disappeared in Tamaulipas, also known as the Collective of the Disappeared, which helped around 600 other families search for their missing loved ones. She became, without ever planning to, one of the most respected human rights activists in northern Mexico. The cartel never forgot her. In March 2017, 29 prisoners escaped through a tunnel from the prison in Ciudad Victoria. At least one of the men who had been involved in Karen's kidnapping was among the escapees. Miriam knew immediately what this meant. According to the BBC, she contacted authorities and asked for police protection. The state government responded by sending police to patrol outside her home a few times a day. That was it. That was the protection they offered a woman who had personally helped capture members of one of the most violent cartels on the planet. On May 10, 2017, Mexican Mother's Day, Miriam was at home in San Fernando. She had recently broken her foot while chasing a suspect, so she was moving around on crutches. Sometime that evening, a vehicle pulled up to her house. According to news reports, gunmen got out and shot her at least 12 times. Her husband found her a short time later, lying in the driveway. Her hand was inside her purse, where she kept a real handgun she had started carrying for protection. She was rushed toward the hospital, but did not survive the trip. She was 57 years old. The men who killed her had been freed by the same broken system that had failed to protect her daughter 5 years earlier. Mexican authorities promised an investigation. The promise sounded familiar. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case shows another mother in another part of Mexico, except this one was barely a mother at all when the cartel came for her, with her newborn baby still in her arms. Section 7. Anabel Flores Salazar, taken from her newborn at 2 a.m. Anabel Flores Salazar was 32 years old, a mother of 2, and a crime reporter in one of the most dangerous places in the world to be a journalist. She lived in a house in the mountains of Mariano Escobedo, a small community near the city of Orizaba in the Mexican state of Veracruz. By early February 2016, she had just given birth. Her newborn baby was about 2 weeks old. Her older son was 4. Her job at the local newspaper, El Sol de Orizaba, paid her as a freelance crime reporter. That meant she covered shootings, traffic accidents, police raids, and anything else violent that happened in her area. In Veracruz, that meant she covered a lot. Veracruz had become a graveyard for journalists. Since 2010, when a politician named Javier Duarte took office as governor of the state, at least 15 reporters had been killed and several more had vanished. The state was anchored by Los Zetas, the same cartel originally formed by deserters from the Mexican army that had already been responsible for several of the killings in this video. Los Zetas controlled smuggling routes, kidnapping rings, extortion operations, and migrant trafficking through the state. They also controlled what could and could not be published in local newspapers. Reporters who pushed too hard ended up dead. And the governor's office had a habit of suggesting almost immediately after every dead journalist was found, that the reporter must have had ties to a criminal group. It was a way of making the public stop asking questions. Anabel knew the danger. According to news reports, she had been seen in August 2014 at a restaurant where Mexican military forces arrested an alleged Los Zetas member known as El Pantera. Her aunt later told the Committee to Protect Journalists that Anabel had simply been at the restaurant having a meal with family at the same time, and there was no real connection between her and the man being arrested. But that one moment was enough for the cartel to mark her, and enough for the governor's office to use later to dirty her name. She had also reported, under a pseudonym on Facebook, on the recent arrest of another Los Zetas leader named Joselyn Marquez Balderas, alias El Chichi. El Chichi had been the cartel's boss in the Orizaba and Cordoba region, exactly the territory Anabel covered as a reporter. He had been arrested in late January or early February 2016, only days before she was taken. In the early hours of Monday, February 8, 2016, around 2 in the morning, Anabel was inside her home with her family. Her newborn was beside her. According to her aunt, Sandra Luz Salazar, who was also in the house that night and later spoke to the Committee to Protect Journalists, at least 8 armed men in what looked like military uniforms suddenly forced their way into the home. They went straight to Anabel's room. They were carrying weapons. They told the family they had a warrant for her arrest. They never showed one. Sandra Luz watched as the gunmen pointed their weapons at the family. She begged them not to take Anabel. She told them, in her own words to CPJ, "Please do not take her. She has just had a baby." They did not listen. They forced Anabel out of her home, away from her newborn, away from her 4-year-old son, and put her into one of 3 gray trucks waiting outside. The trucks drove off into the early morning darkness. Her family immediately reported her missing. Around 24 hours later, on the morning of February 9, 2016, her body was found dumped beside the Cuacnopalan-Tehuacan highway in the neighboring state of Puebla. She was identified by her family. The coroner determined that she had been suffocated. According to Freedom House and multiple press freedom organizations, an autopsy indicated she had died of asphyxiation after being tortured. Her hands were bound, and her body was found with a plastic bag covering her head. The day her body was discovered, Mexican authorities also found 2 other bodies nearby on a property linked to drug storage activities. Investigators believed those killings were connected to a story Anabel had been working on at the time of her abduction. Within hours of her body being found, the Veracruz governor's office did exactly what they had done in nearly every other case of a dead journalist in the state. They issued a statement suggesting Anabel had links to organized crime. The governor's office pointed to that 2014 restaurant incident as proof. Carlos Loria, of the Committee to Protect Journalists, publicly condemned the response, accusing Governor Duarte's administration of having a dismal record of impunity and being unwilling to seriously investigate crimes against the press. 5 days after her body was found, Governor Duarte tweeted again. This time, he claimed that Joselyn Marquez Balderas, the same Los Zetas leader known as El Chichi, had ordered Anabel's killing from prison. He claimed Anabel had been using a pseudonymous social media account to publicly denounce El Chichi after his arrest. Other journalists who had known Anabel pushed back. Hugo Morales Alejo, a fellow reporter from the region, told CPJ he was skeptical, since El Chichi was already in a federal prison when Anabel was killed, and would have had a hard time ordering anything from there. 2 arrests were eventually made. In May 2016, a man identified only as Gonzalo Paulo N. was arrested. In August 2016, another man, identified as Manuel N., also known as El Cacharo, a suspected Los Zetas leader, was arrested as the alleged mastermind. In its own statement, the Veracruz Attorney General's office finally admitted what they had spent months trying to deny. They said the motive for the killing was directly related to Anabel's journalism, which had affected the interests of a criminal group. Her newborn would grow up never knowing her. The next case shows that for women in Mexico, refusing the cartel did not always require a press badge or a politician's office. Sometimes all it took was being the only person in town brave enough to wear a police uniform. Section 8. Hermila Garcia Quinones, the lawyer who said, "If you owe nothing, you fear nothing." In the autumn of 2010, the small town of Meoqui in the northern Mexican state of Chihuahua had a problem. Their police chief job was open. The town sat about 70 kilometers south of Chihuahua City, the state capital, in a mostly agricultural region surrounded by farms and ranches. For years, it had been a quiet place where people knew each other, and most violence happened far away in the bigger border cities. But the cartel war had spread. By the end of 2010, a town that would normally see fewer than 10 killings spread across 7 years had recorded around 40 in a single year. The killings were tied to drug traffickers, and the men who normally would have lined up for a job in law enforcement were quietly stepping aside. Nobody wanted to wear the uniform anymore. A 38-year-old woman named Hermila Garcia Quinones did want it. She was a trained lawyer by profession. She was single, had no children, and lived with her parents, whom she helped support financially. She had previously worked as an investigator for the Federal Attorney General's office, which meant she already had real experience inside the Mexican justice system and knew exactly what kind of country she was living in. She was not naive. She was not stepping into the role because she did not understand the danger. She was stepping in because nobody else would, and because the people of Meoqui were her people. On October 9, 2010, Hermila was sworn in as the chief of the Meoqui police force, with around 90 officers under her command. The local press began calling her La Jefa, which in English simply means the boss. From her first day on the job, the way she carried herself was different from almost every other police chief in Mexico at that time. Most officials in cartel territory traveled with armed bodyguards. They drove in armored vehicles. They lived behind walls and changed their routines constantly to make themselves harder to track. Hermila refused all of it. She did not have a personal security detail. According to multiple reports, she did not even regularly carry a weapon for protection. Her reasoning was a single sentence she repeated whenever reporters or her own officers asked why she did not protect herself the way other officials did. She said in Spanish, "If you do not owe anything, you do not fear anything." Her belief was that as long as she had not taken bribes, had not made deals with cartels, had not crossed any lines, she had nothing to be afraid of. She believed that her clean conscience was its own kind of armor. She was wrong. The cartels in Chihuahua at that time did not care about clean consciences. The state had become one of the bloodiest battlegrounds in the entire country, with rival cartels fighting over smuggling routes that fed cocaine, marijuana, and other drugs north into the United States. Ciudad Juarez, the largest city in the state, had become known around the world as the murder capital of the planet, with thousands of killings every year tied to the drug war. Around 30,000 people had already lost their lives across Mexico since President Felipe Calderón had launched his military campaign against the cartels in late 2006. Police officers who refused to be bought were being killed at a steady pace. The previous police chief in a nearby town, Praxedis G. Guerrero, had been killed and his head left outside the police station as a warning. That position had stayed empty for over a year before a 20-year-old criminology student named Marisol Valles Garcia became the next person willing to take the job. Hermila lasted 7 weeks longer than that previous chief had managed. On the morning of November 29, 2010, around 7:20 in the morning, Hermila was driving herself to work. She was alone in her vehicle. She had no security with her. Her route took her through the town of Los Garcia, about 10 kilometers from Meoqui. Somewhere along that road, Gunmen were waiting for her. Their vehicle blocked hers. According to most accounts, they fired at her car, hitting her at least 3 times. She was killed at the scene. Some local reports said she did manage to draw a weapon in the final moments, with a handgun found near her body, though most major news reports describe her as unarmed.
Either way, she had no real chance to fight back against an organized hit team that had clearly been planning to find her on a road where they knew she would be alone. Mexican authorities almost immediately said the killing had the marks of a cartel hit. The state of Chihuahua was being torn apart at that time by a war between 2 of the most powerful organizations in the country. Los Zetas were operating across the region. The Sinaloa Cartel and the Juarez Cartel were also fighting for control of smuggling routes. Whoever ordered her death never publicly claimed it. No specific cartel was officially blamed. No one was arrested or convicted in connection to her killing. Hermila had only been the police chief of Meoqui for 51 days when she was killed. She had not had time to launch any major operations against the cartels. She had not been responsible for any high-profile arrests. The simple fact of being a woman in a uniform, in a town where the cartels expected to call the shots, was enough. In the months and years that followed, her death sent a chill across Mexico. The men who had been afraid to take the police chief job in towns like Meoqui were proven right to be afraid. The few brave women who had stepped up to fill those roles were forced to make impossible choices. Some, like Marisol Valles Garcia, would eventually flee the country with their families and seek asylum in the United States. Hermila did not get the chance to flee. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case shows that a journalist did not need to live in a small border town for a cartel to find her. She could be working for one of the most respected national magazines in all of Mexico, and they would still come for her in the place she felt safest of all. Section 9. Regina Martinez Perez, the reporter who found death in her own bathroom. Regina Martinez Perez was born on September 7, 1963, in a small town in the Mexican state of Veracruz. She grew up in a country where most women of her generation were not encouraged to chase difficult careers, and she chose journalism anyway. She studied at the Universidad Veracruzana, then took her first job at a state-owned television company in Chiapas in the early 1980s. She quickly discovered that the people running the broadcast world expected her to soften her stories, look the other way, and write whatever the political bosses wanted. She refused. After about 5 years of fighting that battle, she switched to print media, because newspapers gave her at least a little more freedom to tell the truth. By the early 2000s, Regina had built a career covering the hardest stories in one of the most corrupt regions in Mexico. She returned home to Veracruz and bounced through several local papers before landing the job that would define her life. In the year 2000, she became the Veracruz correspondent for Proceso, a national investigative magazine based in Mexico City. Proceso was famous in Mexico for one reason. It published the stories no one else dared to publish. Other outlets in the country had been beaten down by threats, advertising boycotts, and physical attacks until they would only print whatever the government wanted. Proceso wrote about the things everyone else avoided, and Regina was its eyes and ears in Veracruz. That was a very dangerous job. The state of Veracruz had become one of the most lucrative pieces of land in all of Mexico for organized crime. It had the longest coastline in the country. It had one of the busiest international ports. It was a perfect doorway for cocaine, methamphetamine chemicals, and weapons. By the late 2000s, Los Zetas, the cartel originally formed by deserters from the Mexican army, had taken control of much of Veracruz. They did not just smuggle drugs. They were extorting businesses, kidnapping migrants for ransom, and running entire towns. And they were doing it with the help of corrupt politicians at every level of state government.
Regina wrote about all of it. Over more than a decade at Proceso, she filed more than 60 reports on government corruption,
Abuses by police and the military, human rights violations against indigenous communities, and the slow takeover of her state by the cartels. She named names. She wrote about the political class that protected the cartels. Many people in Veracruz believed that Governor Fidel Herrera, who ran the state from 2004 to 2010, had a deep connection to Los Zetas. Some people even quietly called him Zeta 1, suggesting he was the most powerful operator in the entire criminal hierarchy of the state. Regina wrote stories that pointed in that direction. She knew the danger. According to court documents and reports from her colleagues, in December 2011, Regina returned home to her small three-room house in the Felipe Carrillo Puerto neighborhood of Jalapa, the capital of Veracruz, and realized someone had been inside while she was away. Nothing had been stolen. The intrusion was a message. From that point on, she told friends she felt afraid for her life. She started telling her boss at Proceso that she was thinking about stepping back from organized crime stories. She kept her doors locked at all times and rarely invited anyone inside. In April 2012, she had one of the busiest weeks of her entire career. In just 5 days, she filed 9 separate stories. She wrote about the arrest of an alleged high-ranking Los Zetas leader, nicknamed Comandante Chaparro. She wrote about 9 police officers who had just been arrested for working for a cartel. She wrote about a local mayor who had been arrested with cartel gunmen after a shootout with the Mexican army. She had also been working on a much bigger story that her editors were waiting for. She had been visiting public cemeteries in Veracruz, comparing the official records of who had been buried with the actual numbers in the graves. She believed the state government was secretly burying hundreds of disappeared people in mass graves to hide the true death toll of the cartel war. That story would have been the biggest of her career. It never got published. In the early hours of April 28, 2012, Regina was inside her own home in Jalapa. Her front door was locked the way it always was. Sometime that morning, attackers got inside. According to forensic reports later cited by international press freedom organizations, she was beaten badly around the face and ribs, and then strangled to death in her own bathroom. She was 48 years old. Her body was found later that day after a neighbor noticed her front door was open and called the police. The attackers had taken her cell phones, her work computer, and her television. They had left other valuables behind. The Veracruz state government, then run by Governor Javier Duarte de Ochoa, immediately tried to push the story that her killing was a robbery gone wrong, possibly even a crime of passion. They said her work as a journalist had nothing to do with it. About 6 months later, authorities arrested a man named Jorge Antonio Hernandez Silva, also known as El Silva. They said he had confessed. He was sentenced in April 2013 to 38 years in prison for her killing. But almost immediately, the case fell apart. Hernandez Silva said in court that he had been tortured into confessing and that his family had been threatened. Just months after his sentencing, judges voted to vacate the conviction because of irregularities in the investigation. The fingerprints found at her crime scene were never matched. Her unfinished story on mass graves vanished with her stolen laptop. To this day, no one has truly been brought to justice for her killing. The next case shows that even more than a decade after Regina, Mexican women were still being killed for having the wrong audience watching at the wrong moment, and this time the entire world saw it happen live. Section 10. Valyria Marquez, killed live on TikTok in front of thousands. Atsiri. Valyria Marquez Lopez was born on February 14, 2002, in the western Mexican state of Jalisco, the same region that holds the city of Guadalajara. She grew up in the era of social media, and unlike most of the women in this video, she was not born into the cartel world. She was a kid who was good at being seen on a camera. By 2018, when she was just 16 years old,
A Mexican clothing brand named Vicio Vanidad picked her as one of their models. From there, her career grew the way modern careers do. She built up a following on Instagram, then TikTok, posting beauty tips, lifestyle content, and pictures of herself in fashionable outfits. In 2021, she won a regional beauty pageant called Miss Rostro,
which translates to Miss Face. She did some advertising work for jewelry and shapewear brands based in Guadalajara. She studied dentistry for a while before deciding cosmetology was a better fit for the career she actually wanted. In 2024, she opened her own beauty salon in the city of Zapopan, a suburb on the edge of Guadalajara. She had over 100,000 followers on Instagram and around 113,000 on TikTok by the time she was 23 years old. Zapopan and the surrounding state of Jalisco are also the home territory of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, known by its Spanish initials CJNG. By 2025, the CJNG had become one of the two most powerful drug trafficking organizations in all of Mexico, alongside the Sinaloa cartel. They controlled massive parts of western Mexico. They had been designated by the United States government as a foreign terrorist organization. They were known for using fake job advertisements to lure young people into their training camps, and for killing recruits who refused to join. And like many cartels in Mexico, they had a long history of pulling young women, especially attractive women in the modeling and beauty world, into their orbit. According to multiple news reports and investigations, Valyria had been romantically connected to a man named Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, also known by the nicknames Doble R and El Doble R. Ruiz Velasco was not a normal boyfriend. He was a high-ranking commander inside the CJNG, considered one of the senior leaders working directly under the cartel's top boss. The U.S. Treasury Department later named him publicly. Whether Valyria fully understood who he was when their relationship started, or whether things turned bad between them later, is something investigators have been working through ever since. What is clear is that by the spring of 2025, something had gone wrong. On the afternoon of Tuesday, May 13, 2025, Valyria was inside her own beauty salon in Zapopan. She started a live stream on TikTok, the way she had done many times before, according to news reports and statements from the Jalisco State Prosecutor's Office. Earlier that same day, hours before the actual live stream, a masked man had arrived at the salon pretending to be a delivery driver. He was accompanied by another man on a motorcycle. They told a woman who worked at the salon that they had a very expensive gift for Valyria that they could only give her in person. Valyria was not there at that moment. They left and came back later. When Valyria returned to the salon and started her live stream, she heard from her staff that two men had been looking for her with a gift. She seemed unsettled. While she was still on camera talking to her thousands of viewers, she said in Spanish that maybe they had been coming to take her, and that she was worried they were going to kill her. She said it almost like a joke. She kept the live stream going. Then someone came to the door. Valyria stood up to receive what looked like a small package and a stuffed animal that resembled a piglet. She came back to her seat smiling and held the stuffed animal up to her camera. According to reporting by CNN, Reuters, the Associated Press, and Mexican state prosecutors, the man who had handed her the gift was the same masked attacker who had been waiting for her. Within seconds, Valyria was shot in the chest and head at point-blank range. She slumped forward in her chair. Blood pooled on the desk in front of her. The TikTok livestream kept going. Her viewers were still watching. The footage stopped only when another person, presumably an employee, picked up Valyria's phone, briefly showing their face on camera, and ended the broadcast. By that point, the video had already been seen and shared all over the internet. Police and ambulances arrived at the salon a short time later. Valyria was confirmed dead at the scene. She was 23 years old. Mexican authorities opened an investigation immediately and treated the case as a femicide, which is the legal term in Mexico for the killing of a woman because of her gender. President Claudia Sheinbaum publicly extended her condolences to Valyria's family and said the Federal Security Cabinet was working with state prosecutors to find those responsible. Investigators very quickly began looking at the connection between Valyria and her ex-partner, Ricardo Ruiz Velasco of the CJNG. A little over a month later, on June 18, 2025, the United States Treasury Department made the cartel link official. The Treasury announced sanctions against 5 senior members of the CJNG. One of those 5 was Ricardo Ruiz Velasco. The official Treasury statement specifically named him as the prime suspect in the killing of his romantic partner, the TikTok influencer, Valyria Marquez. The statement also pointed to her killing as an example of the femicide crisis tearing through Mexico, where the United Nations estimates that around 10 women and girls are killed every day, and where less than 2% of those killings ever end in a criminal conviction. What every story in this video has shown is that women in Mexico, whether they wore a uniform, a press badge, a salon apron, or a cartel girlfriend's gold chain, all paid the same price the moment they became inconvenient. The men with the guns kept walking free, and the families they left behind kept burying their dead. If you enjoyed this deep dive into cartel women punished by the cartel, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.